Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Andersen, CEO and founder of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today, I'm talking with Luke Abbott. Luke is fantastic. He started his career in procurement consulting at Procura and ended up opening and leading their sustainable procurement practice. He has now founded his own technology-enabled procurement consultancy called Equipoise. He's closely involved with the Scope 3 peer group, and he was named one of the next 100 talents by Digital Procurement World. Little known fact is that he also lives a digital nomad lifestyle, so he's always dialing into calls from beautiful and sunny places, which is quite annoying, to be honest. Luke and I know each other quite well, but in this interview we go deep on sustainable procurement, how he works with this topic across clients, and how he's seeing the practice evolving and changing. There's a lot of good insights in this episode, including how Luke doesn't really think collaborating with suppliers on sustainability is that much different from the work procurement has been doing for decades now. Okay, Luke Abbott, CEO and founder of Equipoise and former sustainable procurement lead at Procura Consulting. Here we go. Hi, Luke.
Hello, Thomas. How are you doing?
It's good to see you. I'm very good, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Very well. You've shaved.
I did. It finally came off. My wife is very happy, so that's good.
Fair enough. Maybe you can't get away with this in Copenhagen. Although, as I said, I thought the Viking look was quite suitable.
Exactly. It worked for a little bit. It was fun, but we're over. You know, life crisis is paused, and we go back to normal.
Let me know when you go back to the life crisis. I'm interested in these times.
Give me half a year, then I'll be back probably for next winter.
Cool.
Where are you sitting right now, Luke?
So currently in South London.
Okay.
I have a couple of weeks spent in London visiting some customers, visiting some friends. So
Okay.
yeah, this is where I am right now.
Are you going back south soon?
Headed to Europe again to see some customers, and then just generally, spring has not really sprung in the UK right now, so it's not time to stay here.
Awesome. Yeah, it makes sense. We're not there yet in Denmark, but we'll get there soon.
Oh, exactly. How's the other podcast been going?
It's been going good, I think. It's just a lot of very interesting discussion, so I'm really enjoying that. It's, you know, you and I, we talk frequently, but it puts us in a little bit of a different format, right? To interview you and ask you some questions that I don't ask you normally. So I'm looking forward to that today as well.
Yeah, it'll be great, man. It'll be really good.
Awesome. But let's get into it, Luke. So welcome to Next Frontier.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very excited about today, Luke. It's all about sustainable procurement today, right? So there's a lot I want to pick your brain on because you basically advise companies on sustainable procurement. So I want you to advise me a little bit today and maybe advise our listeners a little bit today. And I want to kind of get a feel for what you're seeing in the market across customers, prospects, those kind of things. And also just super tactically, you know, how do you embed sustainability in the procurement process? Because some of our listeners come from maybe a sustainability background, right? Mm-hmm. So not the classical procurement background. So let's kind of get super tactical and discuss a little bit how can you actually do this in the procurement context.
Mm-hmm. I will do the best I can.
Yeah, I'm setting the bar high, right? Like now you're the expert, so you know, please give us all your expertise. But Luke, before we do that, you've been now working with sustainable procurement. You've been specialized in sustainable procurement for a while. Mm-hmm. I sort of know your story, but we've never talked about it at length, right? So I'd love to start there. You know, tell me a little bit about how did you actually land in sustainable procurement?
Of course, yeah. So since it's a podcast, I'll give the long story. I started out my career, fortunately not too long ago, so it's not going to be really, really long. I started out my career at a specialist procurement and supply chain consultancy company,
Mm-hmm.
straight out of university, very green, knew I wanted to be a management consultant, no idea what procurement was. And I think, in fact, in my interview, and you procurement people are going to be cringing here, but I asked the managing partner, what is an indirect cost in my final interview? Somehow still got the job. And actually, it was a really great journey. The company I worked for, the partners had come out of a German management consultancy called Inverto, who were recently bought by BCG, so some shared lineage there, potentially, Thomas. And they wanted to set up a procurement consultancy really focused on cost reduction for kind of mid-cap companies. I was maybe the fifth member of that company. They were called Procura Consulting. And I was thrown in very much at the deep end, learning by doing, day one on site, no idea really what any of the acronyms meant. And I was sat in a client's office trying to advise them how to reduce their costs. 5 or 6 years later, I think I'd made my way up to the position of manager within this procurement consultancy. We've grown from about 5 to about 35 people.
Wow.
And it was tough. I think a description would be it forged me like a sword. But I got a really great, deep understanding of how to do procurement cost reduction for different businesses. We also expanded our reach into procurement transformation work, so looking at functional operating model designs for businesses with multiple procurement functions across different regions. Did a lot of procurement training, negotiation training, as well as actually sitting in the room with suppliers negotiating deals on behalf of our clients. So I really got an initiation by fire into the world of procurement. And then around about that time, when I was sort of 6 years in, I was kind of thinking a little bit to myself, okay, this is great. I'm learning, I'm progressing. But in the back of my mind, I have this very strong desire to not just put my blood, sweat, and tears into my work because my bosses want that, but also so that it's good for people in society and for people in our planet. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to travel quite a lot while working with Procura, and I could really see some of the social injustices, the environmental problems that we're facing around our world. I think if I'd been just stuck in a little London office the whole time, then I wouldn't have kind of got out of that bubble. I wouldn't have been able to see. But fortunately, through my job, I was able to see what else was going on outside of London or major cities in Europe. And that led me to the field of sustainability. I actually wanted to quit procurement completely and become a sustainability consultant. Tried to apply for a few jobs, and they said, you don't have a degree in this. you didn't do geography. You can't be a sustainability consultant. So I went back to my company. I said, okay, there's this thing called sustainable procurement. Everybody's talking about scope 3. Everyone's talking about the risks of modern slavery and child labor in supply chains. Can I combine my existing knowledge about procurement and supply chain with this topic of sustainability? I pitched the idea to the managing partner of Procura. He said to me, okay, if you think that you can develop a service line about sustainable procurement and we can sell it to our customers, then you go ahead. But you still have to do 100% of your time on procurement, cost reduction, and transformation.
Wow.
So with my extra 10%, 20%, evenings, weekends, I formulated an outline methodology for what would a sustainable procurement consulting service be like. This was about 3 or 4 years ago. There was only one other company at the time that I saw that was specializing specifically in sustainable procurement, another UK consultancy. So I looked at some of their methodologies, I had some ideas, and then we went to some of the existing customers of Procura and we pitched those methodologies. And we won some initial projects. We started to build a little bit of a reputation. This is around the time that I met you, Thomas, looking at sustainable procurement technology tools. And it was going really well. And then Procura, unfortunately, went into administration. So I found myself kind of in this position where I had a flat rented, I had a really good group of friends in London, and I was like, okay, what do I do now? I can either follow the partners of Procura to their next venture. There was a job opportunity waiting for me with a very good consultancy.
Okay.
I could go somewhere else. Or I kind of decided, hey, I've been leading this service line. I've been very close to the partners of the company who've grown, built a big consultancy. Can I do this on my own? I don't have too many responsibilities. I can move out of my flat and go back and live with my parents for a little bit of time. And I said, hey, if Thomas can do it, why can't I?
Amazing. That should be the key takeaway of today.
So yeah, and then yeah, so started Equipoise. And Equipoise is about 18 months old, roughly. We have had tons of success by launching, had a reasonable amount of help along the way. We are entirely bootstrapped, so no investors, but a lot of support from people like yourself, Thomas, co-founder, associates working for us, helping us guide and build our service proposition. And yeah, we've had tons of success. As I mentioned, we're working with some really great customers, got some great recognition. We were named after about 12 months among the top 10 sustainable procurement consultancies, alongside names like BCG, Proxima, Officio. So that has really stood us in good stead. We've run lots of great clients, some of which we're working on together, Thomas. And yeah, the size and the ambition of our clients is only growing every day. So yeah, that's a long story.
That's awesome. I love that, Luke. That's super inspirational, right? And I think you see that. I think you see so many different paths of people coming into sustainability, but your journey of just being super inspired and wanting to work with it, and then being like, okay, hey, I'm going to create my own role, which then ended up being your own department in a consultancy, which then ended up being your own company. That's just super cool. That's how we move forward and make change, right? So very impressive, Luke. What is this thing called sustainable procurement? Like, when you looked at it, so you had no idea about sustainability. You were like, now you finally got kind of up and running with procurement. It sounded like you have little idea about procurement before you joined the procurement consultancy. And then you kind of studied, the competitor, and looked at methodologies and taxonomies and so on. But what in the world is sustainable procurement? Like, what did you guys do? What are you doing now?
So another key piece in that story, and I think something that really articulated sustainability in a good way for me, was a book that I came across called Donut Economics. Now, I studied economics. My studies, I've got to say, were not very helpful for anything that I've gone to do after that. So maybe tip for anyone who's listening who is still studying. But I understood this model, and it was all about...
I think.
Pardon?
I think I've heard about this book.
Yeah, it's a book by a fantastic economist called Kate Raworth.
Okay.
Brilliant economist. And she essentially proposes this model which looks at, rather than an economy's performance being measured on GDP growth, you should actually look at it in terms of the planetary boundaries and social foundations. Now, this kind of articulates what my view of sustainability is. So you should look up the model for sure. It's called the Donut Model. Roughly speaking, on the outside, the planetary boundaries are Earth's life-supporting systems. So what are the things that our Earth needs in order for it to sustain our lives? So a reasonable balance of oxygen in the atmosphere, for example. Also not having too much carbon emissions in the atmosphere, causing global warming. Not polluting our water systems and maintaining the water systems. These kind of things. So these are like our environmental planetary boundaries. And then also what we have are social foundations. So things that you hear a lot about. So ensuring that everyone has proper access to education. There is not too much inequality, be that for gender, race, etc. There's actually none of that, in fact, I should say. And other things like there's access to justice. People feel politically safe. So there are all these different topics that kind of really frame sustainability for me and made me understood, okay, what we're aiming for is a balance between ensuring that everybody in our planet has the social foundation that they need to live prosperous lives, whilst not putting too much pressure on our planet's life-supporting systems. I think our economy to date has done a pretty good job of lifting people out of poverty and addressing some of those social challenges. However, it's come at the expense of our planet. So it's how do we readdress that balance whilst also helping people in society. So that's sustainability. What is sustainable procurement? So for me, sustainable procurement is about helping organizations understand and address the negative environmental and social impacts of their supply chain. So covering a broad range of environmental and social topics. Basically purchasing in a way that is covering all those bases, that is not putting pressure on our planet, that is not negatively discriminating against people or fueling things like child labor and modern slavery.
Okay, well, so that's the negatives. What about the positives? Like I often think about procurement as saying it's a carrot, you keep this contract or you get this contract and you're being evaluated on, sustainability measures. So sure, let's not have any child labor, please. But also, hey, can we be more environmentally friendly? Can we, be more emissions friendly and so on? Is that part of your definition as well?
That is also part of my definition. So I think taking it from what I described as quite an academic view of what is sustainability, what are the things we need to fix, to actually, what is the opportunity for procurement people?
Yeah.
And the more that I've delved into this world, the more I've spoken with CPOs, I find that actually sustainability is kind of the golden ticket in procurement to, for many organizations, elevating the role of procurement with the organization. Okay. Something we always struggled with in the cost reduction space was, okay, yeah, we can save money, that's great, but the procurement person is not sitting on the C-suite. That is not a role that is important. When it comes to transformation, procurement was not seen as a real value driver in the business. Now, with sustainability, this is something that I think that procurement can grab hold of and actually get them to pull them up in the organization, because sustainability is really becoming a top priority for a lot of organizations. If you could draw a line between the way that you are buying and the way that you are marketing your product, then there is a huge value creation opportunity. There's a great example there of Heineken, where they aligned the procurement and marketing functions. The marketing team wanted to be able to say that Heineken was really sustainable. The procurement team wanted to be able to reduce the emissions of all the glass bottles that they were buying. And they did a really nice campaign about the green bottle being actually environmentally green. And that financed the procurement team's program to reduce the emissions of the bottles, buy those in a more responsible way. And the marketing team were like, well, this is just gold dust for us in terms of marketing.
That's interesting. Okay. And I like that segue, Luke, right? Because it's easy for us to just say, hey, planetary boundaries, this is bad for the earth, this is good for the earth, we just need to do it. But at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, the purpose of a company is to make profits, right? So, tangibly, what do clients want to do when it comes to sustainable procurement? So you mentioned, for example, it helps elevate the CPO role a little bit. There's some kind of marketing angles to it. So if you can make some initiatives on the procurement side that you can then communicate about, then that could be an interesting initiatives. Tell me a little bit more about this. Like, what are you seeing? And maybe also if it's changed, since you started working with sustainable procurement, what do people actually, or companies actually want to do in procurement?
Absolutely. So I think there's a piece here around drivers. So like, why does an organization engage a consultancy like Equipoise to do sustainable procurement? It's obviously something we're keen to understand in the outset. And I think there's a few different drivers. So there's one looking that we just covered. So yeah, marketing. So either be this for business to business organizations where they are selling into organizations that have environmental targets and they appreciate that in order for them to be environmentally friendly, their suppliers need to be environmentally friendly. Or if it's a business to customer business, then actually it's people in society saying, okay, I want to buy environmentally responsible, socially responsible product. I want to have a B Corp label on or something like this. So there's the sort of sales marketing driver. There's also a driver of employee driver. So I think to hire and retain the best talent, particularly from like a more junior talent pool, although not necessarily just from a junior talent pool, a company really needs to be taking this seriously. And if anybody knows something about sustainability, they will know that for most organizations, most of their impact is in their supply chain. There's a very famous stat from CDP saying between like 70 and 90% of a company's carbon emissions is in their supply chain. It's not just about carbon emissions, but I think that is indicative of every different sustainability impact that we see, particularly for an organization that is not really producing stuff themselves, but stuff is happening down their supply chain and then they're selling that on. So yeah, there's the employee driver. And another example, there's a very prestigious management consultancy company that we were working with, who myself, I was very keen on working for them at one point in my life. They paid really well. They had a fantastic reputation. They were handing out all the freebies at the campus events. And I was speaking with them, their chief procurement officer, and they were saying, we've had graduates and senior hires turning us down because when they started, one of the perks, which at the time I thought was amazing, is that they get a BMW 1 Series. I was like, great. Okay, you drive this around the country. The problem is people were turning around and saying, this is a diesel car. I do not want to be driving a diesel car around the country. I withdraw my offer. I'm not going to work for you.
Wow.
So yeah, a very visceral example. So yeah, talent, sales, also investors are really driving this. I was listening to a talk recently from Persephone. They've actually built their whole business, and they're a carbon accounting company. They built their whole business around the theory that the finance community is going to be the people driving this change on sustainability. Now, your investors could be literal VCs or private equity, or they could be people funding you. We're working with a scientific research laboratory who are funded by a variety of different nation states. For them, one of their biggest drivers for focusing on sustainability is because they want funding from that nation state to continue, so they can continue their operations and their scientific experiments. So investor pressure is really important. And also cost saving. Cost saving is a real thing when it comes to sustainable procurement. I am honestly a believer that sustainable procurement is actually just good procurement. And if you invest some time and effort in working collaboratively with your suppliers, trying to help them be more efficient with their resources, use less resources, that is going to that's going to result in a true cost decrease for you. So yeah, those are some drivers.
Okay. Let's double click on that one. So what you're basically saying is, when you guys focused on cost reduction specifically, you would have like efficiency discussions with your suppliers. How can we make you more efficient so we can get lower costs, etc. And what you're saying is more efficiency means less waste, means more sustainable, basically.
Absolutely. When we were doing cost reduction work, I've heard this from a variety of different people. We've always been doing this kind of sustainable procurement stuff. We just didn't call it sustainable procurement. We called it demand management, or we called it process optimization. So like a lot of this stuff is not super new. We're now just adding to the business case of why to make a certain change, the fact that it's good for the environment. Again, with this scientific research laboratory, we were looking at, it's going to get a little bit detailed, but we were looking at importing of industrial gases. We were looking at whether those should be bought from a site several kilometers away, or whether they're actually buying so many of these industrial gases that it should be produced on site. Now, there was a business case that went forward. It didn't get approved. This was 5-10 years ago. Now we revisited the same business case with pretty much the same parameters, and we added sustainability as a layer in that and saying, actually, we'll reduce emissions by a certain amount from avoiding the many trucks going. And then that's actually picked up the conversation, and now we're looking at taking that initiative forward. So these things have been going on for a long time. They've maybe not just been framed as sustainable procurement.
Awesome. That's super interesting. I want to deep dive a little bit later on, the different facets of sustainability, because I do think it's a problem that we try to discuss so many things with the same word. But let's wait a little bit with that. Because now we're on a little bit of a discussion about, what did you see being important? And you talk about employee pressure, investor pressure, those kind of things. One of the discussions I recently had with investors was, okay, what economic environment are we in, and how does the economic environment affect it? Is this purely a compliance market? Recession, companies cannot afford to invest in that many things, but they need to be compliant, and there's a lot of legislation already in place or coming up on sustainable supply chains. Or is it, a boom environment where you want to differentiate and you want to invest in your marketing, in your branding from a sustainability point of view? Now, I think that's a little bit too hard of a way to cut it. I think it's somewhere in between. But, in your last, 4 or 5 years working with this topic, has that changed the focus?
So I think you're always going to have your leaders and your laggards. So the leaders are the people who see the value in doing this work. They are using it to differentiate their products and services from other organizations. And then you're going to have your laggards. You're going to have the people who don't have the time, resources, or appreciation of the topic. And the only thing that's going to make them change is regulation. So I think you're always going to have both. I think what's changed since I started doing this is that the regulation has become stronger. We're getting more and more regulations like CSRD, CSDDD, CBAM, alphabet soup of different regulations coming forward.
I spent the entire day, Luke, on CSRD and the actual methodology documents behind it. Oh God. I mean, I have experts that does that, right? But I wanted to dive into the raw materials as well. But holy moly, that's it's a tough read, huh? It's so many, as you say, alphabet soup is so many acronyms. It's really, really hard to read. Like it's written by lawyers for lawyers, and it made me so annoyed because it makes it so hard for people to comprehend and take action on.
Exactly. And that disenfranchises some people, a lot of people, I'm sure. It makes it a real challenge.
Okay, interesting. So let's dive into the topics a little bit, because you've been discussing scope 3. You mentioned compliance a little bit. What are the topics that companies are looking at when it comes to sustainable procurement?
Okay, yeah, good question. So I would say a vast majority of organizations pick their starting point as scope 3 emissions.
Okay.
Rightly or wrongly, this is what they do. I think in the defense of these companies, scope 3 and carbon emissions in general is probably the easiest thing to communicate, because there's a number associated with your carbon emissions. People understand numbers. You can set targets to reduce those, and it does kind of have the most regulation around it right now. So a lot of reporting requirements around initially scope 1 and 2 emissions, for direct emissions, but then increasingly for scope 3, with things like we just mentioned, CSRD, CBAM being appropriate. So this seems to be the common sort of jumping off point, and that happens time and time again. I think it is important for organizations to not have this carbon tunnel vision, because actually if we go back to the more academic stuff, when we're looking at those planetary boundaries, really rising CO2 emissions are a symptom of the wider ecological problem that we're facing. So there are a ton of other really important environmental topics like nature, biodiversity, water stewardship, that people have known about for a long time. But because they're hard to measure, because they're hard to manage the impacts of, people are kind of looking only at scope 3 emissions and carbon emissions in general. So there's a bit of a risk there. There's also the socially responsible procurement sort of topics, things like we mentioned with human rights, gender inequality. There's a really big supply diversity movement, particularly in the US. So those are also areas where people look at. I honestly don't think any chief procurement officer can say that there is a 0% chance that there are human rights infringements of their supply chain. I think that level of granularity and supply chain transparency just does not exist right now.
Yeah, I've almost
So
heard the opposite, that I've seen studies, I can't remember the exact number, but it's somewhere, 30-60% of CPOs think that it's pretty likely that there's like a human rights violation in their supply chain.
absolutely. But again, it's something that's very hard to get to, which is why I think carbon emissions seems to be a bit of a starting point for
Hmm.
people. Setting targets, measuring their emissions, setting targets against the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and then trying to stand up some of these initiatives and actually drive decarbonisation down the value chain.
Hmm. Okay. And we're seeing some patterns on this, certain industries and certain regions where you see some of those topics and domains being more or less pronounced.
Mhm.
Before I kind of, and I think we may have talked about it before, but before I kind of communicate our perspective on it, I'd love to hear yours. Like, you obviously work a lot in the UK, but I guess with companies all over. Do you see, like, is there any patterns to what they demand from a sustainability topic?
Yeah, we work with companies all across the globe. I
Hmm.
would say that um, in terms of the companies who have got themselves to a stage where they understand that sustainability is important and they understand that sustainable procurement is a really big part of that, you're typically looking at either the leaders in each respective industry. So, for example, we're working with the UK's largest housing association. We're
Hmm.
working with the largest scientific research laboratory in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Or you're looking at industries that are particularly ahead of this. Maybe some would argue particularly well funded. People like the pharmaceutical industry, chemicals industry. These guys are really far ahead in terms of that. So either if you're the leader in your industry or the biggest XYZ, or you're part of one of these industries that are really engaged on the topic of sustainability. Automotive is another really good example of that.
Hmm.
And the second part of your question, Thomas, was about the
Yeah, so patterns,
patterns.
you,
Yeah.
you talked a little bit about industries. You also mentioned diversity or supply diversity is big in the US. Is there any
Mhm.
other kind of patterns you're seeing?
Yeah. So I've gone and pressed the flesh in North America, gone to conferences, spoken, and I've got to say, in comparison to Europe, it feels that US companies are further behind on environmental topics.
Okay.
Um, you saw in the last couple of weeks the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, actually removed the requirement for the largest companies in America to report their Scope 3 emissions,
Yeah, I saw that.
um, seen as a bit of a missed opportunity by commentators. Um, yeah, the US is a bit further behind on environmental topics.
Hmm.
However, they are a lot further ahead when it comes to things like supply diversity, ensuring that businesses are engaging minority race, gender, even veteran-owned businesses to kind of bolster that area in the society. Um, we don't do an awful lot of work in Asia Pacific, but my understanding there is that out of the ESG, actually governance is more of a strong topic over there, more of an area of focus, ensuring that you have the right systems in place to ensure that there's enough reporting, people are being in line with regulations in that region. And yeah, in Europe, we seem to be leading on environment. Within the UK specifically, I think potentially we're taking a bit of a backward step in that with some of the policy changes that we're seeing. Whereas Europe is really driving things forward. I think they broke a record for the speed at which the Deforestation Act went through the EU Parliament. That was essentially it wasn't in existence sort of 5 years ago, and then it was drafted, and now it's almost being implemented. So some
Hmm.
really strict regulations there about supply chain transparency for timber to avoid deforestation. So yeah, you're really seeing a mix. I saw an incredible map the other day of different regulations that are popping up around the world. And I think the kind of key message from that is if you see one piece of regulation popping up, see, for example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM in Europe, which is going to propose to put taxes on imported goods from certain industries and asking suppliers from non EU countries to report their emissions. You're going to see something like that, which will ultimately result in a carbon tax. you'll see something like that popping up all across the world. You'll see it in the UK, you'll see it in the US, because these standards and regulations are just getting duplicated around the world.
Awesome. If you still have that, then we'll share the map in the show notes. I think that's
Mm.
super interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about emissions, because I have this pet peeve around emissions. I think we may have discussed it before, but I want to get your point of view on it, because I'm not always right about everything. So it's interesting to discuss. So Scope 3 emissions, emissions of your suppliers. In the beginning, what do? You estimate them. You take the emission factors or categories you buy from, and then there's like an average around that, and you multiply your spend or volume with that. That gives you like an 80-20 perspective on how big those Scope 3 emissions are. Makes it very difficult to reduce them because it's not specific to you. It's just, these are the emissions for buying soybeans on average. What are you going to do? Next step is then working with supplier specific data, and there's this movement towards LCA data, life cycle
Mhm.
analysis data, which requires your suppliers to compute a specific piece of analysis for the products you're buying from them. I have a little bit of a pet peeve with this because it means that a supplier will be doing a lot of LCA analysis. I just don't think it's feasible. But tell me a little bit about Scope 3. What's the trends you're seeing with buyers? How are they working with their suppliers on emissions?
Yeah. So there are so many different supply chains around the world and so many intricacies. It's quite hard to say in one answer. So this is my preface for generalizing a little bit here. Um, but yeah, what I'm seeing the trend towards is actually buyers collaborating in a
Mm-hmm.
non-competitive way with other organizations in their industry, other buyers of the same type of spend, to make what you just described there, suppliers creating a lot of LCAs,
Mm-hmm.
um, actually try to make that a bit easier for them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also seeing large organizations providing tools to those suppliers to help them measure their carbon footprint, measure the carbon footprints of their different products, um, and actually really just take the suppliers on the journey with them. I don't think anybody expects a big request for a company to give them the product carbon footprint or LCA of every single product they're providing to actually work.
Mm-hmm.
There's not too much leverage from buyers to do that in every case. So this collaborative approach is what is being taken. Um, that's what I'm generally seeing. I think it's also really important for large organizations to prioritize. So you mentioned the kind of flow there. It's spend-based assessment, moving down into more granular measures. I think it's really about picking a small number of suppliers, not sending them data requests, but actually getting them in a room, virtual or in person, and speaking to them about the challenges that you're facing, providing them with tools that can help them understanding the environmental impacts of their products, and then working collaboratively with them to reduce those emissions. That's really the key to these kind of initiatives.
Yeah, I get that, but so I struggle with two things, right? I struggle
Yep.
with one. I hate when we're prioritizing too much because I
Mhm.
believe so fundamentally in buying power that I think that all buyers should be asking all suppliers to adhere to certain standards. Because if we do that, we have this major, opportunity for changing the way things are done. Whereas if we always just say, hey, let's just focus on my 80% of spend, my top 100, 200 suppliers, we just limit that impact massively. So I have that problem. Of course, there's a lot of scalability concerns, but that's a technical problem that can be solved. And
Mhm.
then my other problem is ultimately the reason we're doing all of this is we want to be reducing emissions, right? So
Mhm.
we can spend all of our energy calculating and disclosing and providing academically correct measurements of how much these soybeans, are cost from an emissions point of view.
Mhm.
But do you really expect that every single supplier is then going to create a reduction roadmap for every single one of their product lines? Like, this is what we're going to be doing to reduce soybeans, and we're going to be reducing them by 30% by 2030, et cetera, et cetera. Or is the alternative way more simple, really? A supplier needs to disclose their emissions, a supplier needs to set targets to reduce them, and they need to meet those targets. And then I don't care. It's not my job to micromanage the supplier and tell them exactly where they need to reduce and how. I just want to see them reducing, and I want that data verified. And if they can reduce, great, then we're meeting our objectives of reducing emissions globally.
Gosh, I don't want to be one of your suppliers, Thomas. I think the challenge to that is that has been the approach taken by some organizations, and then when they've checked in 2 years' time, no emission reductions. I really think that there is an appreciation that this has got to be a two-way street. Reflecting this back to the world of cost reduction, we could send out emails and letters asking for fixed percentage reductions every year. We would probably be met by suboptimal results. We wouldn't get the savings that we wanted. If we sat in a room with those suppliers and we helped understand what are the things that we as buyers can do to reduce their costs. So what can we do to make it easier to work with us? And then we share the profits of, or the reductions in money needing to use to provision that service supply or goods supply. So I do think that is needed. I will say it's also not realistic to expect procurement teams who are extremely stretched, don't necessarily know an awful lot about sustainability, to sit down with those suppliers and talk them through what I just described. So there is also a need at the macro level, or maybe the top-down level, for procurement leaders to actually embed things like carbon into the decision-making process. And I sat on a really great call with the CPO of Haleon, who organization recently spun out of GSK. And they were talking about an initiative to get together with other chief procurement officers, not just in the pharma industry, but across industry, to create a methodology to embed carbon in the decision-making process for procurements. So for any sustainability people listening, traditionally, when you're scoring a tender, you have your price and you have your quality scoring for every different bid you receive. What is being proposed is that rather than where sustainability criteria have currently typically sit, which is in the quality area, we actually embed sustainability and carbon into the price area. So we create an internal carbon price for the different goods and services that we're buying. And we mandate to suppliers that you need to provide us the data to help us make that decision. And if you do not, we will use industry standard, industry averages, plus 50%. So using industry emission factors plus 50%, or you provide us with our own carbon data, or with your actual carbon data and product footprints. So I think there's a two-pronged approach. You do have to take slightly your attitude, Thomas, and just say, hey, you just need to do it, guys. This is the mechanism that we're going to work towards. But you also then need to hold their hands and support them through that change process.
Awesome. And I think that really touches a little bit upon procurement's role, and I think it varies with company size and procurement maturity and those kind of things, but not to underestimate procurement's role in strategically supporting that supplier, at least that strategic supplier. It's been done traditionally from an innovations point of view, from a cost reduction point of view, and it makes sense to do it as well from a sustainability point of view. It's really part of your capability as a procurement team to make sure your suppliers are developing in the trajectory you want them to.
Exactly. And this is the exact communications that we're seeing from our customers and that we're advising our customers to do. I hosted a supplier engagement day a month ago with a big pharmaceutical company called Lonza. They pitched their ideas for how they were going to make their supply chain more sustainable. There were some key targets there around science-based target setting and also getting suppliers to rate their ESG maturity a little bit more holistically. And there were some pretty strong asks there. They were like, you need to measure your emissions, you need to report them to us, you need to set targets. You also need to do certain assessments to get a proper view of how mature you are in ESG. And in the future, at some unspecified amount of time, we will incorporate this into our sourcing decisions. And at the lowest level of maturity, if you're not meeting that, you're not going to win any contracts with us. And then in a few years' time, the next lowest level of maturity, you won't win any contracts with us. But here are the tools that we will give you to support you on that journey. Here is access to this supplier academy. Here is access to this tool. So I'm really seeing that that is the kind of best in class approach. Is it going to make enough change in enough time? I don't know. I think we also need governments to step up. We need policymakers to accelerate that kind of change. But I think we'll get there eventually.
Awesome. Okay, so let me try to summarize from the non-procurement listener. Embedding sustainability in procurement. You've talked about a few different things. You've talked about concrete initiatives that you can use from a marketing and branding point of view. So now you have some concrete stuff and data that you can actually communicate about rather than just fluff and greenwashing. You've talked about supplier empowerment. So really helping your suppliers get to where you need them to get, empowering them, whether it's by connecting them with resources, academies, sitting down with them face to face and walking them through it. You've talked about the power of having carbon was mentioned a lot, but also other sustainability components within the sourcing evaluation. So making sure that you're being scored on sustainability, not just on quality and price, as you say. Are there other places in the procurement process that sustainability should be embedded?
It needs to be embedded across the whole procurement life cycle, right from where we're capturing. You're referring to the procurement life cycle, the kind of the define requirements, go out to market, set tender. Is this what you're talking about?
Could be sourcing, could also be supply management, I guess, whatever has to do with your supply chain.
Got you, yeah. So I think it needs to be embedded at every single stage. Again, I'll move the reflection back to cost reduction. I think a majority of the cost and the majority, therefore, also of the sustainability impact of the good or service you're buying is baked in at the requirements definition stage. If the procurement team do not have the opportunity to sit with the engineers, the end users when they're defining their requirements and encouraging them to think about sustainability, then the impact that the procurement person is going to be able to have when they take that specification and go out to market is significantly limited. So we really need to be thinking about engaging early with our end users to help shape those requirements and challenge those requirements as well. Then, of course, when it comes to finding your suppliers, there are some great resources, Nudge to Responsibly here, to help understand how sustainable your suppliers are and potential suppliers are, particularly related to different environmental and social sustainability objectives. Then, of course, when it comes to selecting those suppliers, you've got tools like embedding carbon into the pricing that you're getting and considering that. You can also make requirements around different sustainability targets that the supplier either has now or should commit to make throughout the duration of the contract. If you're afraid of limiting competition, you can always make requirements. If you win this, you should then do this while you're working with us. So that's important in the tender stage and getting people to commit to these. The Chancery Lane project is also a fantastic resource for anybody looking for contract clauses for helping people embed climate-related decisions, climate-related things into supplier contracts. And then it's also really important to manage the contract effectively. So you might not be in a procurement organization that is running a lot of tenders. You might have a lot of very long-term strategic suppliers in place that either you can't change or just by the nature of the business you're not changing. That's where your supplier management comes in. That's when this kind of supplier engagement, asking suppliers to sit down with you, talk through how you can make the contracts more environmentally responsible, more socially responsible, and working together with suppliers, giving them tools to help them with those objectives. And then I would just say one thing that we've not really touched on, Thomas. This has all been quite externally focused. So what do you do with your suppliers? How do you engage them? I think another really important consideration is what do we do internally within the procurement function? And that applies whether or not you do or don't have a procurement function. We've certainly worked with some organizations that do not have people directly responsible for procurement, and it's just end users out in the business who are responsible for buying things. Those organizations also need to think about sustainability and how they're buying goods and services. So when it comes to internal sustainable procurement, how do you develop that? You're looking, I think, at the skills of your people. Do they understand the core concepts in sustainability? You're looking at the systems that they use. Can they easily answer the question, how sustainable are my suppliers? What's the carbon footprint of my supply chain? Digital tools are really, really helpful for this. Do they have the right policies in place? Do they have a sustainable procurement policy? Does their organization have a sustainability strategy? How are we linking into that? You can't do sustainable procurement if there's nothing else in your business that is telling you to do it. You'll probably get fired. So we need those policies in place. And then finally, it's the procurement process. Like, how is it embedded into the procurement process? Is what I just described there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, that was interesting. Thanks for bringing in the internal angle there. We definitely see a major struggle with just the complexity of sustainability. And procurement people, I think you mentioned earlier, are already super stretched. They have a lot of work on their plate, and now you're asking them to take over this incredibly complex topic that people specialize in for years and years. And you're like, okay, now you also got to judge that. Like it's a little bit of a different domain than a price number is, right? It's quite tricky to wrap your head around.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, Luke, there's a lot of topics I want to discuss with you, but there's one last one that I want to try to get across before we end today. And that's really saying, this all sounds good and well. We need to integrate sustainability in our procurement processes. We need to help suppliers. We need to evaluate suppliers, those kind of things. As a supplier, though, you're not the only customer, right? You have a lot of different customers. We recently did an analysis at Responsibly to see all of the suppliers we're engaging. Who are we engaging in the supplying company, right? And it's typically like the key account manager, the business development person, like the people selling stuff. So those are the ones you're contacting. So, there's definitely endless examples of strong buyer-supplier collaborations. Now we really get together and we work on this. And then there's probably also just a lot of suppliers that, just will say whatever they need to say to win a contract.
Yeah.
So, and I get it, right? Because you have hundreds of customers, and here comes another, sometimes a little bit arrogant customer, and it's like, this is how we do things, and this is what we need from you. How does that supplier perspective surface in your work?
So yeah, we've definitely had suppliers turn around and say, hey, that's great, you want to do sustainability, but you are not a priority for us right now. And in those cases, you sometimes have to turn around and say, okay, well, you make up a very small portion of their business. They are in a business, and they know that they're in a business that is hard to become more sustainable because of the way their industry is shaped. And then maybe you've got to move on to another one of the Jenga blocks in the tower that is a little bit easier to push. I think something that does give you leverage,
I like the Jenga block, and which of those blocks are easier to push through?
It is your job, I think, as somebody working in sustainable procurement, to be able to test and say, am I going to spend the next 6 months getting nowhere with this supplier? That is part of the skill set. And going back to the skill set of procurement people, I think what procurement people are actually wickedly good at is getting leverage over their suppliers, be that for cost reduction or be that for sustainability. And I think actually what I'm seeing is more and more a trend is towards collaboration. So organizations getting together, and when they have this supplier who says, hey, no, you're 1% of our revenue or less than 1%, I'm not doing anything for you. This is where we are seeing collaborations on category-focused supplier engagement. So together with the Scope 3 peer group, I know they're running an initiative very soon which looks at the IT category and trying to get many, many different IT category buyers and heads of IT together to engage suppliers all at once. So then suddenly that supplier is not saying, hey, no, you're not important to us. They're actually having like 90% of their customers coming to them with the same request. And this is when the moment when the supplier goes, okay, we need to take this seriously.
Awesome. I like that. Luke, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for that. Are there any last words you want to leave listeners with on how to get started with a sustainable procurement journey?
Absolutely. So you'll all be at different stages in your journey. If you are truly at the beginning, my advice would be to look at what is your company saying when it comes to sustainability. Do they have any objectives? What kind of resonates? It might be quite disparate. It might be you're doing beach cleaning days. You might be doing volunteering at soup kitchens. You might be planting trees for some reason that no one understands. Can you take those elements together, try and form that into a list of objectives that you think your company cares about? The technical term for this is materiality assessment, but really what I described is a materiality assessment. What does your customer, what does your company, people within it, and people associated with it, what do they care about? And then have a little think about what are the impacts of your supply chain on those different areas. So does your company have a really strong agenda when it comes to human rights? Are you sourcing a lot of goods and services from low-cost countries? If so, then there's potentially a risk there. Does your company care a lot about environmental sustainability, about water use? Is your company also buying a lot of animal products or a lot of products that come from heavy industry? Okay, this is an area where your internal water use is actually going to be really impacted. So that's the kind of area where you want to start. And then you should just start pushing and looking at some of your top suppliers, seeing what they're doing, trying to open up conversations with them about how can we work together to reduce the environmental impact of the goods and services that we're buying. A really good place to start as well when it comes to sustainability topics is actually looking at Scope 3 carbon emissions. For often the kind of penny drop moment for a lot of organizations is when they measure their total environmental footprint, Scope 1, 2, and 3, and they realize that Scope 3 is maybe 80% of their total footprint. And that kind of turns the heads of the sustainability people who may have been working on initiatives to change LED light bulbs in the offices, to do more recycling of paper, which is all really good stuff, but they've been completely missing the supply chain emissions, which make up 80% of their footprint. That is the penny drop moment where actually the procurement team starts to get some resource and to focus on sustainability, and it can kind of be a positive kind of trickle down from there, starting with emissions and then going to other topics as well.
I love it. Thank you so much for that, Luke. Luke, thank you for coming on Next Frontier.
No problem. It's been an absolute pleasure, Thomas. I hope we see you again soon.
Absolutely. We will. Bye.
Cheers.
If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Soto, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.